He was a leader who conquered a continent, a lover whose passion was legendary, and a prisoner who died alone on a desolate island. Was Napoleon a hero or a villain? You decide. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story, where you'll not only discover the life of this incredible man, but also boost your English skills. So let's begin. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the 15th of August in the year 1769. He was born on a small island called Corsica. This island was a part of France, but it had its own unique culture, its own feeling, and its own history. Napoleon came from a family that was respectable, but not very rich. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer. He worked very hard to provide for his family. He came from a noble family, a family with a title, but they did not have much money. Napoleon's mother, Letizia Bonaparte, was a very strong and protective woman. She cared deeply for her children, and she made sure that they all received a good education. However, Napoleon did not have a very good relationship with his father. Carlo was often away from home working or involved in politics, and Napoleon felt that his father didn't show him enough love or attention. As a young boy, he was much closer to his mother. She was the one who was always there for him, a constant source of strength in his life. Now, from a young age, people around Napoleon often made fun of him for being short. He was only about 5 feet 6 inches tall, which was shorter than most of the men in France at that time. Some people would call him small or weak. This hurt him, of course, but this criticism did not make him feel small inside. Instead, it made him more determined. He hated being called short, and he wanted to prove to everyone that his size did not matter at all. It certainly didn't stop him from dreaming big. Deep inside, Napoleon believed that he was meant for greatness. When he was just 9 years old, he was sent away from his home in Corsica to mainland France. He was going to attend a military school. This was a very difficult time for him. He was far away from his family, especially his mother, and he felt very lonely. To make things worse, his classmates made fun of his accent. He spoke French with a Corsican dialect, and it sounded very different from the French that the other boys spoke. But instead of feeling sad or giving up, Napoleon decided to work even harder. He buried himself in his studies. He became an excellent student, especially in subjects like mathematics. He knew that these skills would help him later in his career as a military leader. At just 16 years old, Napoleon graduated from the military school. He then joined the French army as a second lieutenant, a very junior officer. He immediately began to show his natural skills as a leader. But even though he had talent, Napoleon still faced many challenges. At this time, the French Revolution was happening. It was a period of great change and chaos. There was a lot of political unrest in France. The country was divided, and many different groups were fighting for power. Napoleon's big dream was to free his country from all of this chaos. He wanted to help France become strong and united again. He wanted to be the one in charge, not just to have power, but to bring the people of France together and make them feel proud of their country. This dream was like a fire that burned inside him every single day. His early years in the army were filled with struggles. He had to deal with senior officers who looked down on him because of his Corsican background and his small size. He also had to fight in dangerous battles and was often sent on very difficult missions. But Napoleon was smart, and he did not give up. He learned everything he could about war, about tactics, about leadership, and about how to win. He was always studying, always thinking, always planning how to make France stronger. One of the most important moments in Napoleon's early life happened when he was just 20 years old. During this time, Napoleon was promoted to the rank of captain in the army. His first big chance to really lead came during a battle in Italy. The French army was fighting against a much larger enemy force, But Napoleon led his troops with great skill and courage, and he won the battle. This victory made people start to take notice of him. After that, Napoleon was quickly promoted to the rank of general, a very high position in the army. He was only 2 years old. This was an incredibly young age to become a general, but it showed how much trust people were beginning to have in his abilities. At this time, Napoleon's dreams started to feel like they could come true. He wasn't just another soldier anymore. He was a leader with an army of thousands of men looking up to him. Even though Napoleon was growing in power, he still had many enemies. Some people didn't like him because he was from Corsica. They thought he wasn't truly French. Others saw him as too ambitious, too hungry for power. But Napoleon didn't care what they thought. He was completely focused on his goals and was determined to succeed. Napoleon Bonaparte was now a rising star in the French military. He had proven his talent on the battlefield, but he was still not yet one of the most powerful men in France. However, everything in his life was about to change, not just politically, but personally. This was the year he met the great love of his life, a woman named Joséphine de Beauharnais. When they met, Joséphine was 6 years older than Napoleon. She was 32 years old, and Napoleon was 26. She was a widow, as her first husband had been executed during the French Revolution. She had 2 children from her first marriage, and she was well known in Paris for her beauty, her charm, and her elegance. From the moment he saw her, Napoleon was completely captivated. Even though she was older and had children, he didn't care at all. He fell deeply and passionately in love with her. Joséphine was different from any other woman he had ever met. She was graceful, she was confident, and she had a certain mystery about her. She knew how to charm people and had many admirers. At first, she didn't take Napoleon very seriously. After all, he was younger than her, he wasn't very rich, and at that time, he was not yet truly powerful. But Napoleon was persistent. He began to write her passionate love letters expressing just how much he adored her. Even when he was far away on military campaigns, he would write to her constantly. He would tell her how much he missed her, how he dreamed of being with her, and how his love for her grew every day. In one of his letters, he wrote, "Since I left you, I have been constantly sad. My happiness is to be near you." He would write, "In the midst of my soldiers, my thoughts drift to you, my beloved. I love you more each day, and I long for your touch." His love for Joséphine was so deep that sometimes it even distracted him from his work. But for Joséphine, it was a little different. She enjoyed the attention from this intense young general, but she did not have the same deep, burning feelings for him. However, Napoleon was determined to marry her, and in 1796 he succeeded. They were married on March 9, 1796, in a simple civil ceremony in Paris. But there was no time for a honeymoon. Just 2 days after their wedding, Napoleon had to leave for battle. Napoleon was sent to Italy to lead the French army there. At the time, France was at war with Austria, and Italy was the main battleground. This was the first time Napoleon would have full command of an entire army. When he arrived, the French army in Italy was in a terrible state. It was weak, poorly supplied, and demoralized. The soldiers had very little food and no proper weapons. Many generals before Napoleon had tried and failed in Italy. But Napoleon had something that the other generals did not: a brilliant strategy and an unbreakable confidence. He completely transformed the army. He gave powerful, inspiring speeches, making the soldiers believe in themselves and believe they could win. He moved his army with incredible speed, attacking the Austrians and their allies before they were even ready. His tactics were so creative and unpredictable that his enemies never knew what to expect. From 1796 to 1797, Napoleon won a series of brilliant victories. At the Battle of Lodi, he personally led his troops across a bridge while under heavy enemy fire, proving his incredible courage. At the Battle of Arcole, in a moment of great inspiration, he grabbed a flag and ran straight toward the enemy lines, inspiring his soldiers to follow him. And at the Battle of Rivoli, he completely defeated the Austrians, forcing them to surrender. These victories made Napoleon a national hero in France. His soldiers adored him. They would follow him anywhere. And all of France now saw him as a true military genius. But even there on the battlefield, surrounded by war, Napoleon never stopped thinking about Joséphine. However, back in Paris, Joséphine was not as faithful as Napoleon. She had started an affair with another man while Napoleon was away fighting for France. When Napoleon eventually found out, he was heartbroken. The news crushed him, but his love for Joséphine was so strong, so deep, that in the end, he forgave her. After his incredible success in Italy, the French government gave Napoleon a new and ambitious mission to invade Egypt. He was 28 years old. At this time, Britain was France's biggest enemy. Britain controlled India, which was a very rich colony. Napoleon's plan was to cut off Britain's important trade route to India. To do this, he decided to take over Egypt, which was a crucial link between Europe and Asia. Napoleon set sail with a large army. But he didn't just bring soldiers, he also brought many scientists and scholars with him. He wanted not just to conquer Egypt, but also to bring French culture and knowledge to this ancient land. In 1798, in one of his most famous battles, the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon's army faced the Mamluks, the rulers of Egypt. The Mamluks were fierce warriors, but they fought using old traditional methods. Napoleon, on the other hand, used modern strategies and organized his army in a special way. The French won the battle easily. Napoleon entered Cairo, the capital of Egypt, as a great conqueror. But then disaster struck. The British Navy, led by the famous Admiral Horatio Nelson, found and destroyed Napoleon's entire fleet of ships in the Battle of the Nile. Suddenly, Napoleon and his army were trapped in Egypt. He could not return to France by sea. Meanwhile, back in France, the government was weak and corrupt. It was failing. Napoleon saw this as a golden opportunity. He secretly left Egypt, abandoning his army there, and made a dangerous journey back to France. When Napoleon arrived in Paris, he found the country in chaos, just as he had expected. The government was falling apart, and the people had lost all trust in their leaders. Napoleon knew that this was his moment. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon led a coup d'état, which means he overthrew the government by force. He took control and made himself the first consul, the most powerful man in France. He was only 30 years old, but now he ruled the entire country. Now that he was in power, Napoleon wanted to make France strong again. He made many important changes. He fixed the economy by creating a strong national financial system. He created a new set of laws called the Napoleonic Code, which gave all citizens more rights and organized the country. He built new schools and universities, and he encouraged education for everyone. And of course, Napoleon also continued winning battles. In 1800, he crossed the Alps with his army and defeated the Austrians once again at the Battle of Marengo. The people of France loved him for this. They saw him as a savior, a leader who could bring stability, order, and greatness back to their country. Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer just a military general or a political leader. On the 2nd of December, 1804, he took the final step. He became the Emperor of France. The ceremony was held in the Grand Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. But this coronation was different from any other in history. Usually, when a new king or emperor was crowned, the Pope would place the crown on his head. This was a symbol that the ruler was chosen by God. But Napoleon refused to let this happen. At the very last moment, just as the Pope was about to crown him, Napoleon took the crown himself and placed it on his own head. The message was clear. It was as if he was saying, "I am not chosen by God or by any religious authority. I take this power with my own hands. I rule because of my own strength and my own achievements, not because of tradition." It was a bold and shocking move. But Napoleon had a clear vision. He wanted to build a powerful French empire, one that was stronger than any other in Europe. His wife Joséphine stood beside him and was crowned as empress. Even though she had been unfaithful to him in the past, Napoleon still loved her deeply. But their relationship would soon face even more difficult problems. As soon as Napoleon became emperor, the rest of Europe became very nervous. Countries like Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia saw him as a serious threat. They feared that he would try to conquer all of Europe. And they were right. Napoleon wanted to expand the French Empire, and his main goal was to defeat Britain, France's greatest enemy. But Britain had the strongest navy in the world. Napoleon knew that he could not defeat the British at sea, so he decided to focus on land battles instead. Napoleon's enemies, Austria and Russia, joined forces to try and defeat him. They gathered a huge army of 90,000 soldiers. Napoleon had only 68,000. Many people thought that Napoleon would finally lose. But Napoleon had one of the greatest military minds in history. He used a brilliant and daring strategy. He made it look like his army was weak, and he pretended to retreat. The Austrian and Russian armies fell right into his trap. Then, at the perfect moment, Napoleon launched a surprise attack from the sides and the center. His soldiers fought with incredible skill and speed. The result was a massive victory for Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz. Over 36,000 Austrian and Russian soldiers were killed or captured. The Austrian emperor was forced to surrender. With this victory, Napoleon became the undisputed ruler of continental Europe. This battle is still studied in military academies today. It perfectly showed Napoleon's genius as a commander. After the victory, Napoleon told his men, "Soldiers, I am proud of you. This is one of the greatest victories in history. You have won the love of France." His soldiers adored him. They truly believed he was invincible. Since Napoleon could not defeat Britain in a direct battle, he tried another strategy: economic warfare. He created something called the Continental System. This was a rule that banned all European countries under his control from trading with Britain. His goal was to ruin Britain's economy by cutting off all its trade. But the plan had serious problems. Many countries secretly ignored the rule and continued to trade with Britain. And France itself began to suffer, as businesses could not get the goods they needed. Napoleon's strategy ultimately failed, and Britain remained strong. In 1807, the war turned towards Russia and Prussia. Napoleon first focused on Prussia. In 1806, at the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt, he completely crushed the Prussian army. The Prussian king had to surrender, and Napoleon's power grew even more. But his biggest challenge was Russia. The Russians were tough, resilient warriors. Their country was huge, and their army was strong. But Napoleon was ready. In 1807, he defeated the Russian army at the Battle of Friedland. After this victory, Tsar Alexander I of Russia had no choice but to sign a peace treaty with Napoleon. Now almost all of Europe was under Napoleon's control. He was at the absolute height of his power. France was the strongest country in Europe. Napoleon's empire was expanding every year. He was seen as a legendary, almost mythical leader. But power always comes with its own problems. Napoleon had everything a man could want: power, wealth, and victory after victory. But one important thing was missing. He had no heir. Joséphine had never been able to give him a child. This was a very big problem because every emperor needed a son to continue his dynasty. Napoleon loved Joséphine, but he felt that he needed an heir more than anything. So in 1809, he made a painful and difficult decision. He divorced Joséphine. Even though he still loved her deeply, he knew that he had to marry someone else to have children. This was heartbreaking for both of them. When Joséphine left the palace, she cried uncontrollably. Napoleon later said, "Joséphine, you were the only woman I have ever truly loved." Napoleon needed a political alliance as well as a wife, so he married Marie-Louise, the young daughter of the Emperor of Austria. She was only 18 years old, while Napoleon was 41. 1 year later, in 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to Napoleon's son, who was named Napoleon II. Napoleon was overjoyed. He finally had an heir to continue his empire. But just as his personal life seemed to become stable, his vast empire was about to collapse. Napoleon made the biggest mistake of his entire career. He decided to invade Russia. Russia had broken the peace treaty, and Napoleon wanted to punish them. But he completely underestimated the brutal Russian winter. He marched into Russia with a massive army of 600,000 soldiers. But the Russians used a clever and cruel strategy. They retreated, and as they went, they burned their own cities and all their food supplies. This left Napoleon's army with nothing to eat and nowhere to shelter. The French soldiers froze and starved to death in the brutal, unforgiving Russian winter. By the time Napoleon and his army returned to France, he had lost more than 500,000 men. This was the beginning of his downfall. After Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, his enemies saw a golden opportunity. The once invincible French army was now terribly weakened, and Europe's most powerful nations were ready to take their revenge. A new alliance was formed against him, known as the Sixth Coalition. It included Britain-Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and Spain. But Napoleon, despite losing 500,000 soldiers in Russia, refused to give up. He quickly built a new army filled with fresh recruits. These were young, inexperienced soldiers, but they were inspired by Napoleon's unbreakable spirit. He told them, "Soldiers, we may have lost battles, but we have not lost our honor. France still stands strong, and I will lead you to victory." But this time, Napoleon was facing all of Europe at once. His biggest battle was fought in Leipzig, Germany, in October of 1813. Napoleon had around 200,000 soldiers. The coalition army had a massive 350,000 soldiers. It was the largest battle in Europe before the First World War. For 3 long days, the French army fought bravely, but they were simply outnumbered. Napoleon tried every possible strategy, but his enemies surrounded him from all sides. Then his own allies betrayed him. The Saxons who were fighting for Napoleon switched sides in the middle of the battle and started attacking the French. This was a complete disaster. Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. As the French army tried to escape, a crucial bridge was destroyed too soon, leaving thousands of French soldiers trapped on the other side of the river. Napoleon watched in horror as his men drowned in the river or were slaughtered by the enemy. By the end of the battle, Napoleon had lost another 80,000 soldiers. His empire was falling apart. After this crushing defeat, the coalition forces invaded France itself. The enemy armies marched all the way to Paris. The people of France, who had once seen Napoleon as their hero, now blamed him for all of their suffering. His own generals came to him and said, "Emperor, we cannot fight anymore. We must surrender." Napoleon was heartbroken. He had dedicated his entire life to France, and now even his most loyal men had lost their faith in him. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated. He gave up his throne. For the first time in 20 years, Napoleon was no longer the ruler of France. But his enemies did not kill him. Instead, they exiled him to a small island called Elba, which is near the coast of Italy. Napoleon, the man who had once ruled most of Europe, was now a prisoner on a tiny island. As he boarded the ship to Elba, he told his loyal men, "France, I have given you everything, and now I must leave you." He cried as he waved goodbye to his soldiers. It truly seemed like this was the end of Napoleon's story. But Napoleon was not a man who accepted defeat easily. After just 10 months on Elba, Napoleon heard some shocking news. The new French king, Louis XVIII, was unpopular. The people of France missed the glory and excitement of Napoleon's rule, and the army was still loyal to him. So Napoleon planned his escape. He escaped from Elba and returned to the shores of France with just 1,000 soldiers. He began to march toward Paris. The French king sent an army to stop him. But when Napoleon stood before them, he did something incredible. He opened his coat and said, "If any man wants to kill his emperor, here I am." There was a long silence. Then the soldiers joined him. Within just 20 days, Napoleon marched into Paris and became emperor once again. It was one of the most incredible comebacks in all of history. The people celebrated. They believed that Napoleon would bring back the glory of France. But his enemies in Europe were furious. The coalition powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, declared that Napoleon was a threat to the world. They gathered their armies for one final battle. Napoleon's return to power would last only 100 days. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced the British and Prussian armies near the village of Waterloo, in what is now Belgium. This was the battle that would decide everything. Napoleon had 72,000 soldiers. The combined British and Prussian forces had 118,000. Napoleon had one last chance to defeat his enemies and reclaim his empire. At first, Napoleon's troops fought bravely and began to push back the British army. But then disaster struck again. A huge rainstorm turned the entire battlefield into thick, deep mud. Napoleon's heavy cannons got stuck, slowing down his attack. Then the Prussian army arrived on the battlefield, and Napoleon's army was surrounded. The French fought until the very last moment, but by the evening it was clear that Napoleon had lost. His dreams of ruling Europe once again were over. As his army collapsed around him, Napoleon rode away, knowing that it was the end. After his final defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon surrendered to the British. This time, they did not send him to a nearby island. They sent him far, far away to St. Helena, a remote, lonely island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There was no escape this time. Napoleon spent the last 6 years of his life on St. Helena. He had no army, no power, and no hope of ever returning. At first, he spent his time writing his memoirs telling his life story. He wanted the world to hear his side of the story. He wrote about his great victories, his deep love for France, and the mistakes he had made. But as the years passed, his health started to decline. His body became weak. He suffered from constant stomach pain. His hair started falling out. He could no longer ride horses or walk for very long. He spent most of his time just sitting and thinking. One of his few joys was talking about his past. His few followers on the island would listen to his stories, amazed by this man who had once ruled half of Europe. One day he looked out at the endless ocean and said quietly, "I was born on an island, and I am dying on an island." Napoleon knew his time was ending. On the morning of May 5, 1821, Napoleon could barely speak. His final words were a whisper, "France." Army. Head of the army, Joséphine. At 5:49 in the evening, Napoleon Bonaparte died. The great emperor who once controlled Europe, who had fought against the world's greatest armies, now lay in a simple bed thousands of miles away from his homeland. The British buried him on St. Helena under a simple unnamed tombstone. But before he died, Napoleon had told his close friends, "I wish to be buried in Paris, near the river Seine, among the French people I loved so much." His wish would eventually be fulfilled, but not yet. 19 years after his death in 1840, the French people demanded that Napoleon's body be brought back to France. The King of France, Louis-Philippe, sent a ship to St. Helena. When Napoleon's remains finally returned to Paris, thousands and thousands of people gathered to honor him. His coffin was placed on a magnificent golden carriage, and his body was carried through the streets. People wept, and they cheered his name, "Vive l'Empereur!" Long live the Emperor! Napoleon was finally buried at Les Invalides, a magnificent tomb in the heart of Paris, where he still rests today. Even in death, Napoleon remained a legend. Napoleon's life was filled with great victories and great failures. But from his incredible journey, we can learn some powerful lessons. First, dream big. But start small. Napoleon was born on a small island. People made fun of him, calling him short and weak, but he never let their words stop him. He once said, "The battlefield is a stage where the smallest man can become the greatest." It doesn't matter where you come from. Your dreams can take you anywhere. Second, hard work beats talent. Napoleon wasn't born a genius, but he worked harder than everyone else. He studied day and night. He read every book he could find on war. He planned every single move carefully. He once said, "Victory belongs to the most persevering." It's not always about how smart or talented you are. It's about how hard you are willing to work. Third, never fear failure. Napoleon faced huge defeats, Russia, Leipzig, and Waterloo, but every single time he stood up again. Even after being exiled to an island, he returned to France and ruled for 100 more days. He believed, courage isn't having the strength to go on. It is going on when you have no strength. Failure is not the end. The only real failure is giving up. Fourth, led by example. Napoleon didn't just command his soldiers from a safe place. He stood with them. When his men were cold, he slept in the snow with them. When they were hungry, he ate the same simple food as them. Because of this, his soldiers would follow him anywhere. If you want people to follow you, you must show them the way. And finally, learn from your mistakes. Napoleon's greatest mistake was his endless hunger for power. He ignored warnings about invading Russia. He trusted the wrong people. He started to believe that he could win forever. This cost him everything. He once admitted, "I have made mistakes. I have seen the limits of my powers." Success and fame are temporary. The real victory is knowing when to stop. Napoleon was a hero to some and a villain to others. To France, he was a leader who gave them glory, pride, and order. To the rest of Europe, he was a threat who started endless wars. But no matter what people think, his name still echoes through history. He changed laws, he redefined warfare, and he inspired millions of people. Even today, his tactics are studied in military schools all around the world. He proved that one person with a powerful vision can indeed change the world. And now I ask you the same question I asked at the beginning. After hearing his story, was Napoleon a hero? Or was he a villain? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this story and learned something new. Until next time, take care and keep learning.